She was a young woman whose life seemed woven from threads of silence and endurance, yet within her small world she guarded treasures that were more valuable to her than any gold. In the corner of the room where she slept, beneath the thatched roof that let in fragments of starlight at night, she kept a folded cloth bundle. Inside it were her belongings, modest in number but rich with meaning, each carrying a story, a memory, a heartbeat from her past that she refused to let vanish. She would often open it in secret, touching each item as if greeting an old friend, reminding herself that she was more than the cruelty that surrounded her. The first piece was a dress, faded now but once vibrant with deep red and blue patterns. It had been sewn by her mother's hands when she was a child, and though it no longer fit, she had wrapped it carefully so that its fabric would not tear. Sometimes she would press her face against it, breathing in the faint scent of smoke and palm oil that still clung to the threads, a reminder of evenings when her mother had hummed by the fire, her presence a shield against the harshness of the world. The dress was not just cloth, it was a memory made tangible, a whisper from a woman who had loved her fiercely before being taken by illness too soon. There were beads too, strung in uneven rows, bright with colors that had dulled over the years. They were simple beads, nothing rare or costly, but to her they glittered with significance. Her mother had worn them during festivals, and when the laughter of the village rose in songs and drumming, she had danced with those beads catching firelight. When her mother passed, the beads were placed into her hands with a quiet blessing, and since then she had never parted from them. At night she sometimes tied them around her wrist or her neck, imagining the weight as her mother's gentle embrace. When loneliness bit at her spirit, she would roll the beads between her fingers, one by one, grounding herself in their warmth. But the most precious of all her possessions was a carved wooden doll, no taller than her hand. It had been made by her mother's brother long ago, shaped from dark polished wood, its tiny body smoothed with care, its round head etched with little patterns. Though its face bore only simple grooves for eyes and mouth, to her it was alive, a keeper of memory. As a child she had whispered secrets to it, confiding her fears and dreams when no one else listened. Even as she grew older, she never stopped speaking to it in moments of solitude, as if her mother's spirit resided within the doll's silent form. When her stepfather shouted or when the weight of the world seemed unbearable, she would clutch the doll to her chest, feeling braver, steadier, as though it carried her across the storm. These belongings, though humble, were the threads of her soul's tapestry. They kept her connected to the love she had once known, and to the girl she was determined never to forget. Her stepfather mocked them, often sneering at how she valued such trifles. He would say they were worthless scraps, nothing but a reminder that she clung to the dead instead of facing life as it was. Yet she ignored his cruelty, because deep inside she knew that without these things she would lose the last fragments of herself. They were not merely objects, they were anchors of memory, innocence and hope, proof that she had once been cherished in a world that now seemed determined to erase her. Every evening, after the chores forced upon her were done, she would retreat to her corner, unwrap the bundle, and let her fingers wander over the treasures. The beads would clink softly, the cloth would unfold like a story opening again, and the doll would stare back at her with unchanging patience. In those quiet hours she could imagine herself surrounded by love rather than neglect, by warmth rather than the cold glare of her stepfather's disdain. Her belongings made her feel whole, and though the villagers and her own family might have forgotten her worth, these little things reminded her that she mattered. The girl carried herself gently, never harsh, never cruel, even when cruelty was all she received. Children in the village sometimes watched her with wide eyes, noticing how she moved with calmness even under scorn, how her songs hummed softly as she worked by the river or gathered firewood. Some admired her beauty, though she never flaunted it, but what truly set her apart was her serenity, the quiet resilience that glowed even in her suffering. It was that serenity, her stepfather believed, that made others whisper of her with kindness, and that whisper gnawed at him with envy. For where he carried bitterness, she carried light, and the light reminded him of all he had lost, all he could never possess. And so she returned day after day, to her small bundle of belongings. To anyone else it was nothing, a cloth, some beads, a toy, but to her, it was a kingdom of memory, a sanctuary built from the past. Within it lived her innocence, her hope, her sense of self unshaken by cruelty. She clung to them as though they were her last bridge to her mother's voice, her family's love, and the dream that she might one day rise beyond the shadows of her stepfather's resentment. She believed, quietly and fiercely, that these treasures were the only fire she had to keep her soul alive, never knowing that from their ashes would one day rise a power her tormentor could never imagine. Her stepfather was a man whose heart seemed carved from stone, his every thought twisted by envy and bitterness. He could not bear the sight of her small joys, the gentle dignity with which she carried herself, nor the quiet reverence with which she treated her mother's gifts. Each bead, each fold of cloth, each carved wooden doll was to him a provocation, a reminder that she possessed something he could never claim, something untouched by his cruelty. In his eyes, the girl was not a child to be protected or nurtured, but a burden, a constant affront to his authority and pride. From the first days of his guardianship, he had watched her with suspicion. He noted how she moved quietly, how her eyes sparkled with kindness even when the world was unkind, and how the villagers occasionally glanced her way with admiration. In his mind, admiration and envy were dangerous, corrupting forces that had no place under his roof. He murmured to himself in the dark hours, his words laced with anger, imagining ways to assert dominance over the girl, to crush the spirit that refused to bow to him. He was meticulous in his plotting, letting no day pass without scheming, turning his thoughts into a silent war waged within the home. He began with small cruelties. Clothes left for her were always coarse and ill-fitting, never as soft or colorful as the dresses she treasured. Her chores were doubled, her meals often meager while he indulged himself, and her attempts at small joys were ridiculed openly. The beads she wore, the doll she clutched, even her simple smiles were met with disdain. "Why do you cling to the dead?" he would hiss. "Is their memory worth more than your life here, under my roof?" His words were sharp, each syllable designed to cut through her resolve, to make her question her worth, to undermine the gentle courage she had carried since childhood. His cruelty did not stop at words. The stepfather would snatch her belongings from her hands, tossing them to the dirt or fire, watching her flinch as if her soul could be shattered by their destruction. Each time he did so, he felt a twisted satisfaction, imagining that he was breaking not just objects, but the very spirit that dared to exist independently of him. He believed that by controlling her he could mold her, bend her, reduce her to nothing, and in doing so, affirm his own dominance and erase the quiet light she carried. Yet the more he tried to impose fear and humiliation, the more he noticed the stubborn resilience in her. She did not cry out for long, nor did she plead for mercy in ways that would satisfy his appetite for control. Instead, she endured, keeping her dignity intact even as he raged. This endurance enraged him further. He could not comprehend that a child, so seemingly frail, could resist the kind of psychological domination he wielded so effortlessly over others. He saw her persistence as insolence, and every act of her courage became fuel for the hatred boiling inside him. He began plotting larger, more destructive acts. In his mind, if he could strip her of her cherished possessions, isolate her completely, or humiliate her in front of the villagers, he would finally assert complete dominance. He spoke to neighbors and kin, planting seeds of doubt about her worth, spreading rumors that she was ungrateful or dangerous. Every whispered accusation was calculated to make her appear small and insignificant, and every knowing glance he cast her way was loaded with threat. He imagined the satisfaction he would feel when she was reduced to nothing, her light extinguished entirely by his machinations. At night, when the house was silent, he would sit by the hearth, staring into the fire as if seeking inspiration from its flames. He imagined the girl's screams, the collapse of her defenses, and the destruction of the treasures that connected her to her mother's memory. The firelight would flicker across his face, highlighting the cold calculation in his eyes, and he would smile cruelly at each imagined victory. He took joy in her suffering, seeing it as both a personal triumph and a rightful retribution for a girl who dared to be different, who dared to hold on to anything that reminded her of love and innocence. But even as he plotted, he could not entirely grasp the power that lay dormant in the girl's connection to her treasured belongings, the resilience that grew quietly in her heart. He saw her as a weak and fragile child, incapable of responding to his schemes with anything more than silent fear. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that her bond with memory, with love, and with her own dignity was not something he could sever so easily. Every act of cruelty, every harsh word, every stolen or broken object, unwittingly fanned the embers of a power that was growing beyond his understanding, a force rooted in the purity of her spirit and the treasures he sought to destroy. He would not stop and she could not fight openly. This was a quiet war, a slow-burning conflict between cruelty and resilience, each day stretching into the next with tension thick as smoke. He was relentless, and he believed himself unstoppable, convinced that the girl's joy, hope, and memory could all be obliterated with a few calculated acts. Yet in his obsession to crush her, he failed to see that his own actions were cultivating the very force that would one day rise against him, a wrath born not of malice but of the dignity and innocence he had so cruelly attempted to destroy. The stepfather's hatred was total, consuming every thought, coloring every interaction and driving every decision. He believed himself master of her life, blind to the quiet, powerful truth that innocence, love and memory can never be fully destroyed. His cruelty was his cage, but it was a cage that could not contain what was growing quietly, imperceptibly, in the heart of the girl he sought to break. The stepfather's anger reached its peak one scorching afternoon when he decided that words and threats were no longer sufficient. Action was required to demonstrate his dominance and extinguish the girl's small joys. The villagers gathered in muted curiosity, some out of fear, others out of morbid fascination. Their whispers carried through the dusty courtyard, echoing against the walls of the modest hut where the girl's cherished belongings lay neatly arranged on a worn mat. Each item, a carefully folded cloth, beads strung with love, a carved wooden doll whose face had been smoothed by her mother's hands, represented not just memory but resilience, a defiance that the stepfather could not endure. He approached the collection slowly, each footstep deliberate, each movement heavy with intention. The girl knelt nearby, clutching her knees, her eyes wide but not entirely devoid of hope. She knew what he intended, but even as terror gripped her chest, she refused to scream. Her breaths came shallow and uneven, each one a mixture of dread and silent pleading. The villagers held their collective breath, sensing that this act was no mere reprimand but a ritual of humiliation and cruelty, designed to strip her of the last vestiges of her dignity. The stepfather's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. He grabbed the smallest of her treasures first, the carved wooden doll. Its features were delicate, its tiny hands polished from years of being held and cherished. Without hesitation, he hurled it into a pile of kindling he had assembled nearby. The wood crackled as the flames licked the edges of the doll, consuming it. Smoke rose in twisted, dark tendrils, curling into the sky as if mocking the girl's anguish. Her lips trembled, but no sound escaped. Tears welled in her eyes, streaming down her cheeks as she watched the embodiment of her mother's love reduced to ash and blackened splinters. The stepfather laughed then, a cold, cruel sound that cut through the still air. His laughter was not just amusement, it was triumph, a declaration that her small joys meant nothing, that her resistance could be erased with fire. He picked up her beaded necklaces next, their colors bright and intricate, each bead a tiny memory, a story told silently with every clasp. He tossed them into the flames. The beads glowed for a moment, reflecting the sunlight in fiery bursts before cracking and melting into the heat, joining the smoke that swirled into the afternoon sky. The villagers flinched at the smell of burning wood, fabric and resin. Some averted their eyes, unable to watch the deliberate destruction of something so innocent, while others whispered encouragements, driven by fear of the stepfather's wrath should they intervene. The girl's anguish deepened, a raw, aching pain that seemed to extend beyond the loss of objects. These treasures were fragments of her identity, tokens of love and safety, and by destroying them, the stepfather sought to dismantle her very essence. Each item that succumbed to the fire felt like a strike against her soul, a punishment for her existence. She lowered her head, letting the tears fall freely now, the smoke stinging her eyes, her heart tightening with grief. Her small hands, empty and trembling, wished desperately that she could retrieve even a single piece, but the heat and the flames were merciless, and the stepfather stood over her, a sentinel of cruelty. He moved systematically, ensuring that nothing remained. The folded cloths, the simple embroidered garments, and the few trinkets that had survived his previous attempts at humiliation were all cast into the fire. Flames roared as if responding to the stepfather's fury, hungrily consuming the memories stitched into the fabric, the stories embedded in each thread. Sparks leaped into the sky, scattering in every direction, and the villagers instinctively stepped back, shielding their eyes from the blistering heat. The girl could feel the warmth of the fire on her skin, not just as heat, but as a palpable wave of loss, a tangible representation of every betrayal and act of cruelty that had been heaped upon her. Yet even as despair threatened to consume her entirely, a flicker of something unspoken stirred within her. The girl's sorrow, her grief, and the injustice of the moment were not powerless. Though her treasured objects lay in ruins, the fire seemed to respond to the intensity of her spirit, not just the stepfather's intent. The flames danced in unusual patterns, twisting in ways that almost resembled a form, a silent, writhing presence that mirrored the girl's anguish. The stepfather, absorbed in his delight, failed to notice the subtle shifts, the strange language of smoke and light that whispered of something far greater than mere destruction. Her voice caught in her throat, but her gaze remained fixed on the fire, seeing not just the ash of her belongings but the sparks of a power she had yet to understand. She felt the heat not as an enemy, but as a strange kind of communion. The smoke rose, carrying not only the scent of destruction but also a trace of her sorrow and resilience, intertwining with the wind, swirling through the village, and seeping into the consciousness of those who had come to watch. The stepfather, satisfied at last, stepped back and surveyed his work. The girl's possessions were gone, reduced to smoldering ash. He smiled triumphantly, unaware that in the heart of destruction, a seed of reckoning had been planted. The villagers, witnessing the totality of the act, could not help but shiver. Some turned away in horror, others in fear, but all felt the weight of the moment, the undeniable truth that this act was more than cruelty, it was an affront to something sacred. As the last sparks died and the blackened remnants cooled, the girl remained kneeling, silent but unbroken. The fire had consumed her treasures, yet it had also awakened something latent within her, a power forged in grief, resilience, and the injustice she had endured. The stepfather walked away, convinced of his victory, laughing under his breath, blind to the gathering storm that would rise from the ashes he had created. The villagers whispered among themselves, uneasy, sensing that this day would not be easily forgotten, that what had been destroyed might yet return in a form none could have anticipated. By the time the sun began to set, the girl rose slowly, her eyes glinting with a quiet intensity. The ashes of her belongings lay around her like a dark circle, but within her heart, something stronger had ignited, a silent promise that the cruelty she endured would not go unanswered. The smoke swirled, carrying with it the whispers of a spirit wronged, a fire that burned far beyond the material realm, waiting patiently for the night when justice would come. The fire had finally settled, leaving behind nothing but a blackened landscape of charred wood, scorched earth, and the smoldering remains of what had once been the girl's treasured belongings. The village square, once alive with mundane chatter and the clamor of daily life, was now hushed, blanketed in an eerie silence. Smoke curled lazily into the sky, dissipating slowly under the setting sun, and the pungent scent of burnt fabric, wood, and resin lingered heavily in the air. The stepfather, sated with his cruel triumph, had withdrawn to his house, leaving the girl alone amid the ruin of her past. Kneeling among the ashes, she lowered her head, her shoulders trembling under the weight of grief and despair. Her small hands, blackened at the tips from contact with the embers, traced invisible patterns over the scattered remains, as if trying to summon the lost pieces back to life. Tears streamed freely down her face, each drop mingling with the ash beneath her, turning the blackened fragments into streaks of gray and silver. She whispered prayers under her breath, soft invocations that flowed from her lips with both sorrow and hope. She called upon the spirits of her ancestors, her late mother, and the unseen guardians of her small life, imploring for comfort, for solace, and perhaps for understanding. Her voice was barely audible, carried away by the wind that rustled through the trees and around the crumbling remains. Yet in that gentle, mournful chant, there was a resonance, an unseen thread connecting her grief to the elements themselves. As the girl's tears fell upon the ashes, something remarkable began to stir. At first, it was subtle, a faint tremor beneath her knees, a whisper of movement within the charred remains that she could not account for. She blinked through her tears, thinking her mind might be playing tricks, that grief had birthed illusions in the smoky haze. But as she observed, the ashes shifted more deliberately. Tiny sparks flared in their midst, not like fire but like tiny stars flickering to life. The wind seemed to carry them, brushing them gently toward her, as though acknowledging her presence. She lowered her head closer, curiosity mingling with her sorrow, and noticed the ash lifting slightly, coalescing in shapes that felt vaguely familiar, like echoes of the item she had loved so dearly. Her heart thudded in her chest, fear and wonder battling within her. Could it be? Had the fire truly taken everything, or was something else at play, an unseen energy that had been dormant, waiting for this precise moment? She reached out, hesitantly, her fingers hovering just above the surface. The ash responded, curling and twisting around her fingertips like soft smoke or liquid shadow. It was warm, alive but not hot, a strange, breathing energy that hummed faintly against her skin. She recoiled slightly, then leaned in, sensing that the stirrings were not malevolent but curious, perhaps protective. The villagers, watching from the edges of the square, dared not approach. Some had retreated to their homes, whispering fearful prayers for their own souls, while others crouched behind fences, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. They saw the smoke rise, the subtle movements in the ashes, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling air. There was a presence in the girl now, a connection to forces they could neither see nor understand. They whispered that the girl was no longer entirely mortal, that something old and powerful had touched her grief and would not let it go unanswered. The girl knelt among the ashes, breathing deeply, her tears moistening the fine black powder beneath her. Slowly, a form began to take shape, a vague outline of her wooden doll, the delicate beads she had strung herself, and even the folds of the cloth that had been burned beyond recognition. The shapes were ethereal, shimmering with a subtle inner light, glowing faintly as if the memories themselves were returning to her through this mystical energy. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and felt the warmth of the unseen force pressing against her fingertips. The ashes were no longer lifeless, they were charged with intent, responding to her sorrow, her prayers, and perhaps the injustice she had endured. Her whispering grew louder, forming words that were both supplication and command, a dialogue between her spirit and the forces she could now feel but not yet fully comprehend. She asked only for guidance, for understanding, and for the preservation of her memories, the essence of what the fire had tried to erase. The ashes swirled, rising into the air like a thin, silver mist, carrying the remnants of her cherished belongings in shapes that almost resembled their original forms. Beads floated, suspended in the air, and the faint outline of the wooden doll appeared, head tilting slightly as if watching over her. Even the cloth seemed to fold itself in the air, draping around her shoulders like a protective veil. The girl gasped softly, overwhelmed by the sight and the presence of something far greater than herself. Though her heart ached from the loss and the cruelty she had endured, she could feel a growing power within her, tethered to the ashes that now obeyed her grief and sorrow. The energy pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat, and the world felt suspended, no longer merely ashes and scorched earth, but a living testament to her resilience and the injustice wrought upon her. The stepfather, returning cautiously, stopped at the edge of the square, his eyes widening in disbelief. What had been destruction now seemed charged with life. The ashes, once dead and blackened, responded to the girl's silent command. She did not raise a hand, she did not speak loud words, yet the energy hummed, palpable and inevitable. The villagers, sensing that something beyond their understanding had awakened, recoiled in fear. The girl remained kneeling, tears streaking her face, but within those tears, a quiet promise burned brighter than any flame. The cruelty she endured would not go unanswered, and what rose from the ashes would eventually demand reckoning. By nightfall, the ash had settled into a subtle, glowing carpet around her. Though outwardly still, it throbbed with unseen life, carrying with it the promise of transformation, revenge, and justice. The girl rose slowly, her eyes glimmering with quiet determination. What had been destroyed by fire now pulsed with an energy that could not be extinguished. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint sparks of that unseen force, hinting at the events yet to come. The stepfather and the villagers retreated into shadows, hearts heavy with fear as the girl remained, kneeling amidst the ashes that had begun to stir, alive with a promise they could not yet comprehend. The night fell with a heavy, oppressive stillness, and the village seemed to hold its breath. The charred remains of the girl's belongings, once lifeless and blackened, now lay before her as if they were aware, pulsing with a faint, almost imperceptible glow. The air carried a strange weight, a combination of smoke, ash, and an energy that prickled the skin and raised goosebumps on the villagers who dared to peek from their hidden corners. Each ember shimmered as if breathing, vibrating with a rhythm that resonated with the girl's own heartbeat. She knelt amidst the remains, her body weak from grief yet strengthened by the quiet, growing force she sensed in the ash around her. As darkness deepened, a low whispering began, carried by the wind, or perhaps originating from the ashes themselves. At first, it was faint, indistinct, like the sighs of spirits moving unseen, brushing past the edges of the girl's consciousness. She paused, holding her breath, trying to discern whether her mind played tricks on her or if the fire had truly left something alive behind. The whispers grew louder, forming patterns, fragments of words that seemed to echo her own sorrow and anger. Remember, justice. Come. The girl's eyes widened in awe, the sound of the ash speaking to her in a language older than the village itself, a language of pain and of righteous power. The faint glow intensified, shifting from gray to silver and occasionally catching hints of green and amber as though the ashes themselves were channeling the energy of the earth, the remnants of fire, and the echoes of her grief into something tangible. Shadows began to move along the ground and walls, stretching unnaturally long and writhing like living creatures. They were not the girl's own, but they responded to her presence, hovering around the glowing ash, intertwining with the scattered remains of her cherished items. Her heart pounded with both fear and fascination. The pain of what had been stolen from her, the cruelty she had endured, and the injustice of her stepfather's malice seemed to merge with the rising power emanating from the ashes. The girl reached out her hand, hesitant yet compelled, and felt a shiver travel through her fingers as they hovered above the glowing remnants. The whispering grew clearer, more insistent, guiding her awareness. Visions began to appear in the flickering silver light. The wooden doll that had once belonged to her mother rose from the ash in translucent form, its carved features glimmering faintly. Beads swirled in the air around her, circling like tiny celestial bodies. The fragments of cloth, charred and torn, assembled themselves into ethereal folds that draped protectively around her shoulders. It was as if her grief, her pain, and her will to endure had awakened the soul of these objects, creating a conduit between her suffering and a rising force from beyond the mortal world. Outside the hut, the wind carried faint whispers that unsettled the villagers who dared to watch. They heard echoes of the girl's anguish, blended with words they could not understand yet felt deep within their bones. Warnings, promises, and something like a hymn of justice. The shadows in the moonlight seemed to stretch toward them, hinting at the power they could not yet comprehend. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, and elders shivered, murmuring prayers and crossing themselves. The girl remained kneeling among the ashes, her tears falling into the glowing fragments, each drop amplifying the strange energy around her. The ash responded as though alive, lifting and swirling around her in gentle spirals that grew bolder with each breath she took. The whispers now carried not only words but images, visions of retribution yet to come. She saw glimpses of her stepfather, laughing cruelly as he threw her belongings into the fire, only to be confronted by an unseen force that twisted the air and scorched his soul. She saw the villagers who had silently watched, powerless and trembling, their shadows growing long and writhing unnaturally in response to the energy stirring within the girl. These were not threats she willed consciously. Rather, the ash and the shadows themselves interpreted her pain and outrage, creating a network of power that seemed to anticipate justice before she even commanded it. The girl's body vibrated with the energy around her. She felt the ash weave into her very being, entering her veins and settling in her chest, merging her essence with the rising force. It was not malevolent, it was protective, affirming, and terrifyingly potent. The whispers grew into a chorus, echoing her deepest sorrow while offering clarity. She was no longer helpless, no longer the victim of cruelty and theft. The ash and shadows were extensions of her own spirit, mirrors of her pain, and now vessels of her potential for justice. As the night progressed, the glowing embers of ash rose higher, twisting and coiling into shapes that suggested motion, faces, and forms the girl recognized from her own life. The stepfather's greedy hands, the laughter of mocking villagers, but all rendered in shifting, spectral silver. Each form seemed to respond to her awareness, waiting for her recognition, her acknowledgement that the time for mourning was ending and the time for reckoning would soon arrive. The whispers now felt almost like a heartbeat shared between her and the ashes, a rhythm that pulsed in synchrony with her thoughts, her grief, and her resolve. By the deepest hour of the night, the air around the hut shimmered with the energy of the awakened ash. Faint sparks floated upward like fireflies, and shadows crawled along walls and floors with deliberate, sentient movements. The girl rose slowly, her eyes bright with the reflection of the glowing ash. Her grief had been transformed into a living, breathing force that now awaited only the dawn to assert itself. She understood that her pain, her suffering, and the injustices she had endured were no longer her burden alone. They had become a force that demanded recognition, respect, and ultimately retribution. The villagers who watched in fear and awe from afar dared not approach. Some whispered prayers, others sank to their knees, shaking in terror. They could feel the pull of something ancient and powerful, a force that had risen from the ashes of cruelty and grief. The girl's shadow stretched long across the ground, merging with the ash and the whispers, forming an unbroken link between her spirit and the awakened remnants of what had been destroyed. The night held its breath, and with it, the promise of the reckoning that the dawn would bring. By the first light of morning, the whispers had softened, but the energy remained, pulsing faintly, almost expectantly. The girl stood amidst the glowing ash, her eyes steady, her breath calm, and the shadows around her stirring with life. She had become the center of a power greater than her own suffering, and the village, whether ready or not, would soon learn that what had been destroyed could rise again, and what rose from the ashes could not be ignored. The night was heavy with the scent of smoke and the sharp tang of charred wood, the remnants of her beloved possessions scattered across the floor like a graveyard of memories. The girl knelt amid the ashes, her small hands trembling from grief and rage, the shadows of the room stretching unnaturally around her. As she whispered her sorrows into the darkness, something began to shift, a subtle vibration beneath her knees, a warmth in the ash that seemed to respond to her very heartbeat. At first, it was faint, a quiver in the air that made the hair on her arms stand on end. Then, with deliberate intent, the ashes began to rise, spiraling slowly, forming shapes that shimmered like liquid gold in the moonlight that filtered through the hut's cracked walls. From the center of the swirling mass, a figure began to emerge. It was no longer simply ash and remnants of what had been, but a presence, alive, aware, and ancient. The spirit took form gradually, materializing as a glowing silhouette infused with fiery tendrils and fragments of her mother's carved wooden doll, the beads and the remnants of her clothes. Each fragment hovered around the entity, orbiting like fragments of her past, memories of love and innocence, feeding the growing power that hummed in the air. Its eyes, though spectral, bore a warmth that mirrored her mother's gaze, a reassurance amid the rising tempest of sorrow and fury within her. The girl reached out instinctively and the spirit's form responded, moving closer until its energy wrapped around her like a protective cloak. She could feel the warmth against her shoulders, the gentle pressure of its presence against her spine. The whispers of the ash, once indecipherable, now formed coherent voices, soft but commanding, speaking the language of memory, grief, and justice. "You are not alone," they murmured. "We are here. We will stand with you." Each word resonated deep within her chest, intertwining with her heartbeat, amplifying her courage and the latent force that had begun to grow within her. The spirit was not passive, it pulsed with intent. Tendrils of fiery energy flickered across its form, illuminating the hut in a spectral blaze that did not burn the girl but set the room alight with power. The ashes beneath them danced, swirling in complex patterns that mirrored the emotions coiling within her. The sorrow of loss, the sting of betrayal, the righteous fury at the cruelty she had endured. Every memory of her mother, every cherished bead, every fragment of cloth that had been burned now glimmered within the spirit, a constellation of love and loss, of pain transformed into potency. As the entity stabilized, it began to whisper not only guidance but visions. In the flickering glow, she saw the stepfather, cruel and laughing as he destroyed her treasures, suddenly frozen in spectral scenes that shimmered and twisted. She saw the villagers who had watched in silence, their shadows distorting unnaturally as though reacting to the awakening power. The spirit seemed to interpret her thoughts and fears, projecting them outward, showing her the scope of the injustice that demanded reckoning. It was both a mirror and a shield, reflecting her pain while shielding her from despair. The girl realized that this spirit was born of more than her suffering. It was the culmination of her mother's love, her own sorrow, and the purity of her heart. It clung to her, winding around her limbs with a gentle pressure that felt like a heartbeat in the air. She felt her fears dissolve into the energy surrounding her, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose. The entity was both a protector and a herald of vengeance, a tangible manifestation of the consequences of cruelty and the enduring power of love that had never been extinguished even by fire. Outside, the wind began to stir, carrying whispers that seemed to emanate from the ashes themselves. Shadows lengthened along the walls, reaching toward the girl and the spirit as though the world was taking note of the force now coalesced within her. Tiny sparks leapt from the ash, tracing arcs of light across the floor, the ceiling and even the broken doorway, painting the room with a fiery halo. The spirit responded to each flicker, amplifying, bending the energy to its will, wrapping the girl in an aura that radiated authority and supernatural presence. She could feel her own strength merging with it, as if the boundaries between herself and the spirit were dissolving. Moments passed, each stretching into eternity. The hut was no longer a place of sorrow but a crucible in which grief, love, and justice fused into something formidable. The girl stood slowly, supported by the spirit's invisible embrace, feeling power surge through her frail frame. Her eyes, reflecting the glow, shone with determination. Every heartbeat, every breath, carried a rhythm that matched the entity's pulse, a synchronized chorus of intent that promised retribution to those who had wronged her. The spirit did not need words to convey its purpose. Its presence alone was instruction. The glowing tendrils coiled and flexed around her, as though testing her awareness and will. With each movement she felt her own courage reinforced, her sorrow transformed into resolve. She understood that the ashes had not only birthed a guardian but had awakened an agent of justice, one that would act not out of blind anger but guided by the principles embedded in her suffering: protection, retribution, and the balance of justice restored. The night deepened further, and the boundaries between the physical world and the spectral realm blurred. The spirit's glow intensified, illuminating the hut with a brilliance that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Its presence radiated outward, and even beyond the hut's walls, the villagers could sense the energy, an oppressive yet magnetic force that made the hairs on their arms stand on end. They felt the weight of their cruelty pressing upon them, a silent, growing warning that something beyond mortal reckoning had awakened in the girl's place of sorrow. By the first light of the moon, the spirit and the girl had become a singular entity in purpose, if not in form. She could feel its protective power surrounding her, an extension of her grief and love, ready to defend, ready to act. It was a sentinel born of suffering, of memory, and of unyielding human spirit. The hut, once a prison of cruelty, had become the birthplace of an avenger, a force destined to confront injustice with the full magnitude of what had risen from the ashes. The girl's heart steadied, her breathing deepened, and she took her first step toward the doorway. The spirit's warmth and energy enveloped her, a reminder that she was no longer alone, that every fragment of her pain had been transformed into a living, breathing power. The wind whispered through the cracks of the walls, carrying a message to the village beyond. The girl was ready, and the force born from love, sorrow, and injustice would not be ignored. The stepfather awoke with a start, his chest heaving, sweat clinging to his brow like a second skin. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon, but the remnants of a nightmare clung to him with suffocating weight. In the dream, he had returned to the hut where he had burned her belongings. The fire that had consumed her cherished possessions rose again, not as simple flames but as a living, searing entity, twisting and reaching toward him with intent. He felt phantom burns sear his arms, stinging as though invisible embers had clung to his flesh. His pride, long a shield against conscience, began to fracture under the relentless onslaught. Everywhere he went, the house seemed altered. The shadows in the corners of his rooms flickered unnaturally, stretching toward him with silent accusation. At first, he blamed the light or the angle of the sun, convincing himself that he had merely imagined it. But when the shadows moved independently of the light, curling and recoiling like serpents, the seed of fear took root. Whispered voices drifted through the hallways, faint but unmistakable, calling his name in tones that were both maternal and accusatory, echoing the voice of the girl whose innocence he had destroyed. "Remember, remember," the voices hissed, each syllable a hammer against his conscience. The first marks appeared on his skin at midday. They were faint, coppery traces along his forearms and hands, as if his flesh bore the outline of tiny flames. At first, he dismissed them as rash or insect bites, but the sensations were too precise, too painful. Each mark throbbed with heat, mirroring the memory of the fire that had consumed her belongings. When he scratched at them, the pain intensified as though the ashes themselves were embedded in his very skin, reacting to the scratches like a living thing. Panic began to suffuse his every thought, the steps he took around the house measured and cautious, as if he could somehow avoid the intangible eyes watching him. Sleep became impossible. Each time he drifted into slumber, the girl appeared. She was no longer the small, helpless figure from his memory but a spectral form wreathed in fire and light, her eyes glimmering with the sorrow and fury of the wronged. She did not speak at first, merely watching, the silence heavier than any scream. And then, in the quiet moments, she began to call out, her voice echoing with layers of sound, the echo of ash, the whisper of crackling embers, the faint memory of her laughter before it was stolen by cruelty. "You cannot escape," the voice would murmur as he jolted awake, clutching his sheets, his face pale and drawn. The village began to notice the change in him. He became withdrawn, jittery, and irritable. Once authoritative, he now flinched at shadows, cursed under his breath at empty corners, and avoided the night sky, fearing that every flicker of light might be her watching eyes. His neighbors whispered among themselves, sensing the weight of a growing curse. Some claimed to hear fire crackling from his hut at odd hours, others reported seeing a faint glow in the windows when no lamps were lit. The stepfather dismissed their words angrily, yet each rumor gnawed at his fragile pride. Nightmares persisted, escalating in intensity. In one dream he walked through the charred remains of the girl's hut, flames licking his legs, yet never consuming him, only stinging, branding him with the memory of his cruelty. She was there at every turn, each apparition more defined, more forceful, her spectral hands lifting embers that struck his body with unseen force. The fire whispered to him, the sound of burning wood merging with her cries, creating a symphony of torment that left him shaking upon waking. He tried to flee the room, leave the village, even hide in the forest, but no place offered reprieve. The ashes followed him, appearing as tiny flecks in the wind, traces of smoke along paths, and faint glows beneath his feet. His sense of reality began to unravel. Day and night blurred as the hauntings intensified. Sometimes he would reach for objects, only to find phantom flames licking at his hands. Sometimes he heard the girl's laughter in the wind, echoing through alleys and empty courtyards. Even when he tried to speak, words caught in his throat, replaced by the faint crackle of unseen fire. His body bore the marks of every fire that had ever touched her belongings, each scar an invisible map of his sins. He began to fear his own reflection, seeing not his face but the glowing remnants of what he had destroyed, a constant reminder of his cruelty. The psychological torment became physical. He developed fevers at night, burning internally as though his body were sustaining a slow, invisible combustion. His pride, once insufferable, crumbled entirely. He could not command respect, could not summon authority. His house, once a bastion of dominance, felt alien, unwelcoming, and oppressive. Each creak of wood, each flicker of shadow, intensified his anxiety. Even the villagers, while terrified, noticed the change. He moved cautiously, muttered to himself, flinched at the smallest sound, as if expecting fire to spring from every corner. As days passed, the stepfather's torment escalated to revelation. He understood that this was no ordinary haunting, it was a judgment. The fire born from the girl's anguish was alive, sentient, and precise in its revenge. He realized that the spirit was attuned to his guilt, feeding on his memories of cruelty, and that there was no escape. The flames did not merely burn, they illuminated the truth of his heart, revealing every act of malice and every moment of indifference. Fear took root not only in his body but in his very soul. By the end of the week he could scarcely leave his hut. Every sound outside reminded him of her presence, every gust of wind felt like her breath. The ashes that had once been inert now lingered on his windowsills, traces of a power that refused to be ignored. Every meal he took, he imagined, would be intercepted by the spectral gaze of the girl. Pride, authority, and arrogance were replaced with trembling and dread. He became a shadow of the man he had been, wholly consumed by the realization that the fire had risen from the ashes not to harm her, but to punish him. In the nights that followed, he began to murmur apologies to the empty air, attempts to placate what could not be appeased. The fire, however, did not relent. It responded only to the truth of his remorse and the depth of his acknowledgement of guilt. Phantom burns left permanent marks on his consciousness, each one a reminder of cruelty's consequences. By the time the villagers looked upon him, he was a man undone, haunted in mind, body, and spirit by the fire born from the girl's suffering, a living testament to the unyielding power of innocence and vengeance entwined. The night arrived heavy and still, the kind of night that presses upon the skin and suffocates the senses. Inside his hut, the stepfather moved restlessly, tossing and turning, attempting to stave off the dread that had become his constant companion. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, though no fire could be seen at least by ordinary eyes. Yet he knew it was there. The spirit of the girl, the fire born from ashes, had fully awakened, and he could feel it coiling around him like a living entity. It was as though the very molecules of the hut pulsed with her wrath, awaiting the moment to strike with the precision of justice long denied. He tried to rise to leave the hut, but his limbs were heavy, weighed down by the unseen force pressing upon him. Every step felt as though he walked through molten tar, slow and suffocating. The room itself seemed to shrink around him, the walls bending inward, the shadows stretching unnaturally, flickering as if in anticipation. He heard whispers that were neither wind nor animal, voices sibilant and accusing, echoing with the rhythm of crackling embers. Remember, the fire remembers, the ashes burn. Each word struck him like a lash, cutting through the fragile veneer of his composure. Suddenly, flames appeared, coalescing in the center of the room, yet curiously they did not touch the walls or the ceiling. They danced with a fluidity that defied nature, bright and blue at the edges, red and molten at the core. They moved with intent, twisting and curling toward him, licking at his ankles and wrists, leaving searing heat that penetrated to his bones. He screamed, a sound guttural and desperate, but no one outside heard it. The village slept on, oblivious to the supernatural reckoning unfolding in that humble hut. The stepfather fell to his knees, pounding the floor with his fists, begging, pleading, and cursing all at once. "Please stop. I beg you, forgive me." His voice was raw, cracked, carrying the weight of years of cruelty and arrogance. But the fire did not falter, did not yield. It responded only to truth, to the full acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. The ashes he had once destroyed, her treasured belongings, had coalesced into a power that demanded the reckoning of the guilty. Every flame reflected her sorrow, her loss, her injustice, and it sought not revenge on the village, but punishment for him alone. He felt invisible hands of heat wrap around him, pressing, constricting, burning without leaving visible scars. His skin tingled, a sensation far beyond normal pain, a kind of infernal heat that burned memory itself. The flames shifted, forming the vague silhouette of the girl, her eyes glowing like molten gold. She watched silently, almost mournfully, as if disappointed that justice had come to this, but resolute that it must. Her spectral hands moved through the air, directing the fire with an elegance that contrasted with the terror it wrought. He writhed, trying to escape, crawling toward the door, but it was as if the very walls had conspired to hold him in place. Smoke filled his lungs, though there was no physical fire consuming the wood. The smell of charred fabric and scorched earth permeated the air, a hallucination or a curse he could not tell. The heat intensified with each passing second, a crescendo of torment. He felt as though he was being unmade, layer by layer, the sins of his heart burning as fiercely as his flesh. Memories assaulted him, every cruel word, every act of theft or scorn toward the girl, every moment he had dismissed her cries or laughter. The fire demanded remembrance before it would release him. And so, he remembered. He wept openly, tears mingling with sweat, whispering her name in trembling fragments. I'm sorry. I beg forgiveness. But the flames, guided by her spirit, moved with purpose, circling him, tightening, consuming the pride, arrogance, and malice that had defined him. Outside the hut, the village remained undisturbed, the night calm and serene. Birds slept, winds whispered through the trees, and the moon cast silver light over thatched roofs. No one saw the fire, no one heard the cries, yet the air itself carried the echo of justice, subtle but undeniable. The villagers would awaken the next day with a vague unease, a sense that something significant had transpired while they slept. Only the stepfather knew the full scope of the reckoning, and that knowledge tormented him beyond comprehension. Hours passed, though time seemed irrelevant inside the hut. The flames maintained their focus, guided by the spirit, burning away his fear and guilt in a methodical, relentless manner. The heat seemed to seep into his very soul, leaving him raw and trembling, yet paradoxically cleansing. It was a punishment both physical and spiritual, one that no human court could deliver, and one that no prayer could avert. The fire was patient, meticulous, and merciless, true justice incarnate. As dawn approached, the flames began to wane, though they did not vanish entirely. They lingered as a faint glow around him, a reminder of the power that had visited. The stepfather lay on the floor, drenched in sweat, shaking violently, skin raw with imagined burns, eyes wide with the memory of the night's terror. He knew, with a certainty that no words could capture, that the girl's spirit had exacted justice. The fire would not leave him entirely, it had burned its mark into his conscience and soul, a permanent witness to cruelty punished. When he finally dared to stand, his body weak and unsteady, he found himself irrevocably changed. Pride, arrogance, and cruelty had been replaced with fear, humility, and reverence. The fire had risen from the ashes of what he had destroyed, and it had burned not the girl, but the malice that resided within him. From that night onward, every flicker of flame reminded him of her presence, every spark of light a silent warning. The spirit of the wronged cannot be ignored, and injustice will find its reckoning. Even as the village awoke, unaware of the night's events, the stepfather knew that he had been marked forever. The girl's spirit had seated justice at his table, and her fire would watch him until his last breath. Every shadow, every ember, every whisper of wind would carry her vigilance. The night of reckoning had passed, but its memory would haunt him eternally.